Welcome to this afternoon's panel discussion, Are the Millennials Revolting?, produced by myself, George Hull, and Alex Benson from Block. We're defining millennials as those who came of age around or after the year 2000. According to this definition, that means there are around 14 million millennials living in the UK. The prevailing narrative from the 1990s was that young people were turned off by the politics of spin. As the left and the right blurred before their eyes, they became less and less engaged, less likely to vote, less likely to take part in campaigns and sign petitions. But recent events appear to reverse this trend. The EU referendum, where millennials were passionate standard bearers for the Remain side, the vocal youth support for veteran socialist Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, and the angry denouncements of the older baby boomer generation for their profligacy, wealth inequality, and issues surrounding social justice. But what is the nature of this engagement? Is it the contemporary manifestation of the same radicalism of youth movements such as the 1960s Paris student riots, the punks in the 70s, the poll tax riots, the 90s ravers? Or does it take a different form? To help us understand and explore these questions, we are honoured to be joined by Rian Mansour, who is the Community and Welfare Officer of the London School of Economics Students' Union. Rian is responsible for taking care of quality of life among the student body, coordinating accommodation issues, creating a more ethically responsible school, and promoting healthy living. She recently appeared on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, defending and articulating the university's safe space policy. Emily Dingsmore, who has very kindly stepped into the breach at the last minute because AZ Lyons was unwell and couldn't attend. Emily is a student at Queen Mary University of London, where she set up a free speech society to hold debates, open up discussions on campus to examine what she perceives as the creep of censorship and erosion of freedoms and liberties and freedoms of speech on campuses. Richard Brooks, who is the Vice President of Union Development at the National Union of Students, spokesperson for the NUS on a number of issues, has described their no platform policy as something akin to not being invited to a house party. Richard has a keen personal and professional interest in the intergenerational divide, and having been president of its university union, reports a weirdly powerful love for the city of Hull. Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked, columnist for The Big Issue, contributor to The Spectator, perched somewhere between libertarian, perhaps contrarian. Brendan is noted for his uncompromising position on free speech and keen interest in the climate on university campuses. In his Stepford Students lead article for The Spectator, Brendan commented that student brains have been replaced by brains bereft of critical faculties and programmed to conform. But he's recently reported a shift in attitudes to conformity on campuses. And finally, Peter Tatchell, director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. Peter requires very little introduction, campaigner and activist for human rights for 50 years standing. In February of this year, Fran Cowling, the LGBT representative of the National Union of Students, refused to share a stage with Peter at Canterbury Christ Church University as she regarded him as transphobic for signing an open letter of support for Germaine Greer, embroiled in a similar row. Peter's response was to declare a McCarthyite, witch-hunting, accusatory atmosphere symptomatic of a decline in open debate on some university campuses. I'm going to invite each of the panellists to speak for 5 minutes as a provocation, and I'll be giving you a 30-second warning when you're coming to the end of your 5 minutes with a yellow card. And then we're going to put this discussion to the floor and have a lively, big, lengthy public discussion over the issues raised. Rian Mansour, are the millennials revolting?
Looking at youth as a monolith is the first mistake. Like women and people of color, it is rarely a productive exercise to consider youth as its own group or argue that they behave in the same way. Youth are the same people who don't vote while simultaneously relentlessly supporting Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. Youth are the group that do not engage in politics while simultaneously disrupting Westminster with demonstrations. So how can these stark narratives exist? How do we repeatedly see youth in these two lights at the same time. Now, this is an oversimplification, of course, but for me, when we look at youth engagement in the public sphere, the conversation can typically be divided into two categories. Those on the inner circle who challenge norms and ideas in a way that is relevant to them, and those who are not engaged in those conversations, who do not understand why the status quo needs to be challenged. So let's take an example. Black culture is a growing and vibrant movement here in the UK and also in the US. We can argue that, for example, when I first came here, I learned everything about grime music and Stormzy within my first couple of weeks, right? So we can argue that black culture is becoming part of the mainstream. But there is a bit of a difference. The conversations are now moving far deeper than that. I ask a series of questions about the world around me. Why does LSE have one black academic and an Africa Center? Why have I learned about the French Revolution but not the Iranian one? Why do I know the difference between France and Belgium but not Benin and Togo? So yes, on some level, black people are more empowered now to have conversations that wouldn't be considered acceptable previously. And through that, they infiltrate the mainstream more than they used to. Pockets of these groups take these conversations further, talking about things such as white privilege, microaggressions, eugenics. Wait, have I lost you yet? You are not the only one. Last week, I went to a symposium between Goldsmiths and LSE where we discussed race in higher education. We talked all day about the function of race, how it changes higher education. And one of the lines that one of the academics said was, the conversation on race is becoming a dull roar. I went home later that evening to see my friends, all LSE students, all youths, and when I told them how my day had went and what I'd spent the day talking about, one of them looked at me and asked, how do you experience racism when your family is not black? And another one said, okay, how do we change this topic? From only 2 hours earlier, when I had spent a whole day discussing in depth the importance and the role of being a woman of color, I was now put in a situation among other youths where race was an uncomfortable topic. This is no one's fault, but the level of ignorance or lack of education surrounding something as basic as what is racism brings forward some interesting questions about just how broadly youths engage with the world around them. Again, we look at the two conversations that young people tend to divide themselves in. Those who consider and question the norm based on the world around them and how they fit into these norms. And those who perhaps already fit into those norms and therefore cannot perceive these different views around them or why they're important. So, what is the difference between youth today and before? We've always had activists in our history. Taking the black example, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But one of the main differences is technology and a liberated world where the views of everyone is considered, on some level, valuable. The recognition that perspective makes a large difference in how you engage in the world around you. The experiences of the minority are slowly being integrated into the majority through concepts such as safe spaces, equality and diversity divisions within organization. LSE has an EDI division. And even to an extent, celebrities like Caitlyn Jenner, who have brought forward a new conversation about being transgendered. With technology, the human experience seems so much more accessible, easy to share, and so the voices seem louder and more prevalent. But are they? I don't know. It's one thing to acknowledge that the people perceive the world around you differently, and another to shift the world in order to accommodate these views. Like everyone else, youth are facing this struggle, but because of our technology, online communities, and just the shareability of information, these voices seem louder, more rebellious than before. But part of it is simply the acknowledgement that different communities exist, that our views are diverse, and that we have a lot to say. It is only now that we're acknowledging that those views and the perspectives that they bring are valuable, and on second hand, learning how to accommodate those views. And this is why it seems so rebellious. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rian. We're going to move on to Emily Dinsdale, who I must say has only had 1 hour to prepare because it was a last-minute thing, the absence of Izzy. So thank you very much, Emily, and off you go.
Okay, so I'd like to start with a short anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, I was walking across my university campus and witnessed students stopping and asking other students, or inviting them, encouraging them, to write about their problems on the ground in chalk, like actually in big letters across what we call Library Square. This was in celebration of World Mental Health Day. And I made it clear that I'm not the biggest fan of these sort of weird interventions, and the fallout from this was remarkable. The students were absolutely disgusted and horrified. How could I be against mental health interventions when the NUS's recent survey has reported that almost 80% of students suffer from a mental health issue? And how can I even talk about this, someone said, when I haven't been the victim of depression or anxiety? A similar thing happened during the EU referendum debate when I announced that I was in support of Brexit. I was immediately branded a bad person by many millennials and similarly received horrified and disgusted remarks and responses from many of my students and other millennials. These two instances, unfortunately, are not isolated examples but are part of a greater narrative of what's happening in UK campuses at the moment. You could call it a revolt, but it's not a liberal revolt, and it's certainly not a radical one. It's not a revolt against the establishment, it's not a revolt against officialdom, it's the strange kind of revolt that's censorious and authoritarian, and it's a revolt against the people and is actually quite conservative in nature. So in essence, this is a revolt of conservatism and not against it, and is happening all the time in universities. Students call for safe spaces where primarily individuals from like smaller minority ethnic groups or women or LGBT groups can gather in a place where they are free from offensive remarks. Students demand trigger warnings on academic material that they might find upsetting. They can even go to module organisers and suggest that they may be pulled from the course because something, let's say, like rape law is so distressing and upsetting that they can't actually sit through a lecture on it. And students are prone to no platforming people who they don't agree with, or they refuse to share panels with other speakers whose views they don't find particularly engaging or favouring to them. So in addition to this, more recently we're seeing an increase in the policing of behaviour of millennials on campus as well. We're told all the time that millennials are hard done by and need special protection. Many universities have introduced consent classes this academic year for incoming students to learn about the rules of sexual relationships. Other universities have run racial awareness classes. Even a renowned London university has run an exploring emotional intelligence workshop for incoming students. And all these classes and seminars and workshops are intended to shape the way students or millennials behave instead of letting us be free to negotiate the adult world ourselves. I think what's particularly worrying about this, that in most cases these workshops and classes are actually student-led, so the millennials themselves are placing these interventions and paternalistic classes on themselves and using this to dictate how we can and cannot behave on campus. So examples of this is if you're going to get drunk and have sex, then you might want to sign a consent agreement, or if you're going to make a joke about a woman, you might want to check your male privilege. And these are quite funny, but they're actually real examples of the kind of thing happening on UK campuses, and it is crazy to suggest that this is somehow rebellious or revolutionary. So what are they actually rebelling against? It seems like they're rebelling against fun and against liberty. So we see the argument that sure, students still hold protests against tuition fees and disability allowance cuts, and when it comes to politics, we've seen millennials come out in their thousands in support of Miliband and Corbyn. But these marches and the occupation of buildings, even then, they're not really a revolt. It's kind of a special pleading with the government to fund us and look after us. And as for the millennial-led movement that idealised Ed Miliband during the last general election, it was far from revolutionary. Students went to Twitter in support of Milibay and superimposed pictures of flowers on his forehead. So even when these millennials seem to be engaging in politics, it's often more about their identity and their suffering rather than engaging with the actual political discourse. And so some of you might say, well, what's the problem with this? At least they're standing for something. And in many cases, these people seem to genuinely be defending minority groups. Ethnic minorities and women are all publicly supported by student unions and the NUS. And often the argument in defence of safe spaces is that it opens up debate for people who have previously not had much of a platform in which to speak freely. but by imposing these special rules and conditions, physical spaces where only certain people can speak, and where clapping is replaced by jazz hands, free speech and freedom in general is being crushed. We are limiting millennials' horizons by shutting down discussions, protecting ourselves in safe space bubbles, and policing harmless human interactions. So in short, yes, the millennials are revolting, but they are far from revolutionary.
Thank you, Emily. Richard Brooks from the National Union of Students.
So I guess my analysis of this would be quite simple, is that yes, I do think millennials are revolting in some ways, not in others. I do think some of us are quite charming. I think that, thank you, that's the only joke I've got, thank you. And I think in some ways I think we have every right to be. If you are of my age, which is 24 years old, so smack bang in the millennial generation, your political history would probably go all the way through from the end of the Iraq War to the expenses scandal to the economic depression, which disproportionately affected people of a younger generation, all the way through to Nick, I'm so sorry, Clegg, to austerity politics and smack bang in 2016, where we obviously had the EU referendum and all of the intergenerational fallout from that. So I think there is a fair amount of cause for millennials and people of a younger generation to be annoyed, to feel aggrieved, to feel like that their life chances, as has been proven by any numerous studies, the Resolution Foundation in particular have been very good on this, talking about how our life chances, our economic opportunities are diminished and less than the generations before us. So I guess that's the first thing to say around like intergenerational inequality. I mean, I think when it comes to, obviously a lot of this debate is going to centre around freedom of speech and safe spaces. We've obviously had this conversation already, and I guess I should touch on that a little bit. And I think my thoughts on this are quite simple in that I very much believe two things. One is that this is an evolution of politics that's happened for a long time. It is not new politics that groups of students who are from marginalised backgrounds, whether or not they're LGBT or BME, get together to discuss each other's experiences and figure out ways forward to try and solve those problems. That is not a new thing. People on this panel, Peter in particular, have been involved in those politics and done an incredible amount of good for any number of years on that. So that's one. And then two is around the furore, I guess is what I'd call it, around what I see as a consistent narrative, building in the media and political commentariat, around how freedom of speech is being oppressed, that we are the enemies of liberty, that anyone who can disagree with the idea of a fascist or a racist being on campus must absolutely loathe freedom of speech. And I guess there are two things with that. One is that I think these instances are wildly overblown, and actually if you delve deep, not actually that particularly deep underneath those headlines and that anger, you'll find some very specific examples of things, often which are not true. Peter, for instance, was not no platformed, neither was Jermaine Grip. And I guess the second thing is around what actually this means, because I very much see this as a new and interesting conversation, evolution of freedom of speech. Because actually the argument goes, and it's one I prescribe to, and I will not agree with many things that I guess people on this panel or other people would say around what NUS's quote-unquote stance is on freedom of speech and no platform policies. There is a live and rigorous debate in student unions and student life, as there is everywhere else. But in reality, I think that a lot of things with what we're doing are enfranchising freedom of speech. Our generation is the most ethnically and culturally diverse, maybe in the history at least, of industrial society. I think that's something to be proud of. And that means that the rules of the game change sometimes. And what that means is, I think sometimes, and this is delicate and this is difficult, is making sure that your spaces, whatever they are open and free to everyone. Now, that doesn't mean no platforming people you disagree with. That doesn't mean people acting like snowflakes and declaring I'm offended every single time someone says something they don't like. What it does mean is that when there are students from different backgrounds and have different experiences, you understand that and you listen to that and you listen to those perspectives. So I guess that's my bit on freedom of speech, and like I said, I think we'll talk about it quite a lot. When it comes to the rest of the debate about are the millennials revolting, I'd actually agree with some of the analysis that has been said earlier. One of the things I think I do find frustrating is that, as I've said before, I think millennials have a right to feel aggrieved for a number of different ways, economically, socially. I think the problem is that politics in general, and I guess the left in particular, where people under the age of 30 tend to place themselves politically, not obviously monolithically, but most data shows on somewhere on that spectrum. I think they've been failed by those people, and the reason why is, this may surprise you, I am a member of the National Union of Students, I am a student leader, hopefully that doesn't surprise you, but I also do not support Jeremy Corbyn. I actually wasn't up until very recently a member of the Labour Party. There are lots of people like that, and in reality, I think a lot of the conversations we're having around are the millennials revolting is that in some ways we're not, because signing up and agreeing with the EU referendum and being a part of the European Union, as was articulated incredibly strongly and well, I thought, is not a particularly radical idea. I think it's a good one, but it's not a particularly radical one. Many of the policies that Jeremy Corbyn and the left of the Labour Party are espousing, my argument has always been, are not particularly radical in the sense that they're not new, a lot of them. They're not different. They are ideas that were based out of social democracy of the 20th century. So I guess my final point would be this, is that I think millennials are revolting. I think they're finding new and interesting ways to do politics around whether or not that's differences around what they eat, what they buy, how they organise, innovative ways of entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship. I think we're finding different ways to be engaged and ethical consumers. I think that things like Black Lives Matter in particular are great examples of operating outside of what are typical party political spectrums, which often aren't particularly engaging or helpful to young people, and are creating a new kind of politics. So I actually think in reality we are revolting. We haven't often found the spaces to articulate that. I think we will, and as every generation does, and I'm looking forward to figuring out what that looks like. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you. Brendan O'Neill.
Yeah, if you want to see how unrevolting or unradical millennials are, you just have to look at the EU referendum and the fact that a lot of them supported the EU. So what you had here was, and not only did they support the EU, not only did they vote for this corrupt, undemocratic, ossified, ridiculous institution, they also wept in the streets when it was defeated by the working classes, who they have no connection with whatsoever, most of them. So what you have is a situation where a lot of millennials, particularly the political ones, particularly the more active student ones, were on the streets fighting for, in defence of, this kind of staid, undemocratic, illiberal institution which is supported by 95% of business leaders, which is supported by the IMF, which is supported by Richard Branson, which is supported by John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, I mean every single member of the establishment effectively. When you find yourself on the same side as those people, you know that you are not in revolt. You know you are not in revolt. There's no question about it. They were foot soldiers of the establishment. They were slaves to the status quo. And it was like, they play at being revolting, they play at being radical, but then they come home for their dinner. When push comes to shove, when the establishment is under attack, they come home, tail between their legs, they kind of brush their hair, do a side parting so their mum doesn't shout at them, and they vote for the personification of the establishment in the 21st century, which is the European Union. So no, that tells you they are not revolting. There's no question about that. My beef with the millennials, and I realise I'm saying this as an old man from Generation X, my beef with the millennials is that to the extent that they are revolting, they're revolting against the good things about their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation, and they're accepting all the bad things. That's my real problem with them. So the good things that they are revolting against is firstly the idea of racial equality. We heard earlier about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. Do not compare yourself to these people, please, because the whole point of Martin Luther King's outlook on life is that people should be judged by their character, not their colour. Millennials do the precise opposite of that. They encourage racial thinking. They are obsessed with race. They think you should interact with people depending on what colour they are, what sex they are, what gender they are, what sexuality they are. You must constantly watch your language depending on the race or gender of the person you're dealing with. It encourages divisiveness and racial thinking rather than the kind of thing that their grandparents or their parents might have argued for, which is that character is what counts, not skin colour. The other good thing that they revolt against is sexual liberation. One of the good things that came out of the 60s was the idea that sex could be fun, particularly for women, who for years and years have been told that they shouldn't enjoy sex because it was just something that men enjoyed, not women. And the idea of radical feminists in the 60s and 70s was that actually sex was a laugh, it was good fun, and you should be able to do it whenever you want with whoever you want. The millennials are completely revolting against that. You can see this in their sexual consent classes, which are ridiculous, and also their whole argument against drunken sex, for example, or regretted sex, or bad sex, all these things which they are increasingly redefining as rape, because they, A, don't understand what rape is, and B, don't understand what sex is, so they're kind of very confused on that. And then the third good thing that they're arguing against is freedom of speech. The one good thing that the 60s generation and the 70s generation did was argue for freedom of speech, particularly in the countercultural arena, the idea that you should be able to publish literature and art and films and all those things, however offensive they were, that you should be allowed to do that stuff. They were very much in favour of freedom of speech. Today's millennials are not. Anything which they deem offensive or harmful or shocking, they will no platform, they will ban, they will rail against, whether it's Robin Thicke's song Blurred Lines, which has been banned on 30 university campuses. It reminds me of when I was at convent school and the nuns used to turn off the radio when Madonna came on. I mean, that's exactly the same situation. Or they banned the Sun newspaper because it used to have naked women in it, and all these ridiculous, prudish, Mary Whitehouse style things. So they revolt against those good things, racial equality, sexual liberation, freedom of movement, and they accept all the bad things about their parents' generation, completely uncritically. Like, for example, environmentalism, the most deadbeat, depressing, anti-human ideology you could ever imagine. They love that. They embrace that nonsense. And they also embrace the therapy culture. One of the worst things about the 60s, which is why I'm so glad I was born after the 60s, is that they were all into therapy, they were all into talking about themselves endlessly on couches. They completely buy into that therapy culture. They completely buy into the idea that human beings are fundamentally fragile and they need this kind of scaffolding of therapy around their lives in order to help them get through every day, effectively. And just on that, finally on that point, what I really think that therapy question reveals is that they're not revolting at all. They're actually conforming to what their parents and their grandparents' generation expected, which is that you should constantly demand not freedom, but recognition. Not liberation, but validation. You must constantly ask officialdom and others to validate your identity, to validate your sense of mental ill health, to validate your victimhood. They are actually conforming brilliantly to the script written for them by that older generation in relation to the idea that people are fundamentally fragile and need constant help. In fact, I can't think of any other generation in living memory which has conformed so spectacularly to the older generation's expectations that they will be weak and pathetic.
Thank you, Brendan. Peter Tatchell.
Well, I'd like to start by correcting you. I did not support Germaine Greer. I totally oppose her point of view on transgender issues and have criticised her on those issues many, many times. What I defended was her right to be heard and her right to be challenged. And that, I think, is what a fundamentally free society is about. It's about challenging bigoted ideas, not simply centering them. If you put the clampers on those ideas, they don't go away. The only way you can effectively defeat them is to expose them, counter them with evidence and argument. That's the way we defeat bigoted ideas. In terms of this whole issue, it's been mentioned that I was not a victim of no platforming. That's true. It's just that Fran Cowling said she wouldn't share a platform if I was on the platform with her. It's perhaps you could say a variation of no platforming, because the implication might have been that the organisers would drop me in favour of her. But anyway, let's not go there. I think the no platform policy of the National Union of Students is actually quite narrowly drawn. It's only about half a dozen organisations, and they are very extremist groups. So far-right neo-Nazis and Islamist groups that are opposed to democracy, human rights, and personal freedom. We can have a debate about whether those restricted, even those restricted no platforms are applicable. What I have the major beef with is the way in which the policy has been much more broadly interpreted by some individual student unions. I think about the example of Maryam Namazi, the Iranian communist feminist, who was barracked and insulted at Goldsmiths College when she tried to speak, and the Islamist group there tried to use the no platform and no space, safe space policy to get her banned from speaking. And when she did speak, they heckled and interrupted her. And of course, they have a right, and I would support their right to challenge her, but not to the point where they were trying to actually stop her from speaking. And again, with the same safe space policy, I mean, in principle, I don't have an objection to it. I think it's good that students have an environment where, you know, racism or misogyny or prejudice against disabled people is challenged. You know, black and disabled and women and others should not have to suffer insults and threats and menaces against them. So the principle is right, but again, it's about how it's interpreted. And I'm sure many of you know the example of Imogen Wilson at Edinburgh University, who raised her hand in disagreement with something that was being said, and then was accused of violating the safe space policy, and there was actually a vote to remove her from the meeting. Fortunately, it was lost, but the fact that a vote was even attempted, let alone held, I think is a pretty damning indictment of the fragile nature of freedom of speech on many of our universities. There's also, for me, a big concern about the victim mentality of many millennials. You know, they often play the victim card and argue that if you're not a woman, you don't have a right to speak on women's issues. So, for example, men have been banned from speaking in debates about abortion. Likewise with LGBT issues. Some students say no straight person should have a right to speak on LGBT issues. Well, as a long-time LGBT activist, I say I'm really glad when straight people want to talk about LGBT issues. And even if I disagree with their perspective, the fact that they're engaging gives me an opportunity, or others an opportunity, to challenge them. So I don't buy this argument that you have to be black to talk on black issues or gay to talk on gay issues. That compartmentalization and fragmentation is very, very unhelpful, and it actually creates or exacerbates divisions rather than overcoming them. The allied issue is, of course, the question of, you can't say that because it offends me. Well, hang on. Some of the most important ideas in human history have caused great offence. You know, you think about it. Mary Wollstonecraft, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and so on. They all said very, very offensive things to some people. Yet those are some of the most important ideas in human history. So I think that we need to accept that some people will say things that are offensive, but unless they actually threaten or menace someone with violence, then I think we have to accept their right to speak and challenge it. Challenge it, counter it, present the alternative evidence. But don't retreat into this soft, cozy world where, oh, you mustn't offend me. Almost anything anyone can ever say will possibly offend someone somewhere. We have to be robust to be able to listen to and counter ideas we find offensive.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for speaking so eloquently and with such brevity on such a complex issue. We're going to put this out to the floor now. I'm sure many of you have lots to say. I'm going to take a handful of points and then come to the panel for a discussion. It's not a straight-up Q&A.
Very quick points. It seems to me that the anti-free speech movement today, extraordinarily cowardly. And you do engage in this sort of doublespeak, whereby you pretend you support the values of free speech, but then simultaneously you advocate safe space policy, no platform. At least Mary Whitehouse and the sort of authoritarian conservatives who wanted to ban or dictate what we were allowed to see on television in the 60s and 70s had the courage to admit that they were supporting censorship and seeking to impose censorship. You engage in this kind of Orwellian doublespeak, whereby you deny you're actually supporting censorship when manifestly, self-evidently, you are. The second point is that the kernel of this all seems to me to come back to identity politics, to the notion that there are marginalized and oppressed groups in this society, when legal and political equality has been long established in this society. So what you're doing is essentially transposing the fascist idea that there is a privileged group of people, which they claimed were the Jews, and then the rest of society who were exploited by that allegedly privileged group of people. You've just transposed that model into this particular context, and thereby you have totally engaged in a reversal of the European Enlightenment, which was about looking at society in universal terms and in terms of individuals, not in terms of groups.
Hi, I'm a millennial, and by now very proudly call this name. A couple of years ago, I would still be very ashamed of that because I would see that point of view that a lot of the criticism would do. However, I think we are a generation that has entered a time that faces a lot of new challenges, that is starting to not be dominated anymore by white older men, but suddenly a lot of minorities are getting more and more vocal, they're getting bigger, starting to not be minorities, especially in big groups, and that just changes the way that we have to deal with these things. So we are in a transformative way, and sure, we're not the most politically engaged generation yet, but I think that has changed with realizing that Brexit can happen, with seeing someone like Trump raising up. I have a lot of hope in this generation because we're starting a conversation that has not started before. I hope someone of you can elaborate on our future.
I am another millennial, well, first of all, I think some of the things I've heard are very big generalizations in the sense that if you claim that every single millennial that supported the EU was just not thinking properly of all the effects, I think you're doing exactly what other people pro-EU that I know say about pro-Brexit people. They say, oh no, they're all racist, and they actually didn't think it through. I know people that wanted Brexit and actually had really coherent arguments, and I know people that didn't, and I know people that wanted to stay in the EU that I could tell, they had no idea. So that's, first of all, I think, putting all the millennials in one box, I think it's a bit problematic. I do agree with the value of offending. I think it's really important, as a society to move forward. But for example, I can think of examples of protesting. I studied at Brunel University, and I can think of examples. Katie Hopkins came to our university to talk in a debate, and some students, they came to the debate and then they left as soon as Katie Hopkins started speaking. I think things like that I don't see a problem with that. They didn't censor Katie, they just left, just expressing that they didn't agree with the way she handled things. So I think there are ways that of protesting that millennials are putting in practice that can still be really, really positive. Finally, I think to prevent millennials not thinking, for thinking and not thinking things through, like supporting Corbyn without actually analysing all the facts. I think the most important thing is to promote critical thinking. And I think, I don't think this is something that is taught enough at universities. And proof of that is that, I came, this Battle of Ideas, which is a debating congress, I found really difficult to find people of my age that wanted to come with me to this event. So that just shows that I think the real problem is not people voting for Corbyn, like millennial people voting for Corbyn or millennial people voting for the EU. The problem is millennials not engaging in real critical thinking and analysing the facts.
Thank you.
Before I start my main point, just wanted to come back to the third speaker who seemed to suggest that millennials are so revolutionary is because our life chances are terrible, we're not going to get good jobs, we're going to live in crap houses, but we've actually never had it so good. I mean, you look at the number of people who are going to university now, it's risen massively. You can come out of university, loads of people are going into these ridiculous graduate schemes where you come out with 30 grand. I mean, I'm sorry, you can't expect to come out of university and live in a mansion. I actually think we're doing quite well. My main point is just that I think one of the interesting things about this millennial revolution, in inverted commas, is actually how vacuous it is. So we look at 1968 in Paris. There we had people on the streets who wanting to throw over capitalism and big business. And nowadays, not only are we having less sex than people in 1968, we're not just drinking less alcohol or taking fewer drugs, but the things that we're fighting for now have no real meaning. I mean, you look at post-Brexit, and you look at these kind of millennials who went on the marches for Europe, etc. they weren't even talking about or arguing about, I don't know, the problems of immigration or economy. Their main concern was that the fact that now, if we do leave the European Union, they might not be able to go on a cheap gap year, that they might not be able to get an Interrail ticket. And what that really reveals is just how vacuous these demands are. But at the same time, what I would say is that even while I will wholeheartedly say that this new kind of millennial fight is kind of absurdly pathetic, I don't think that we should be wholeheartedly criticizing millennials and labeling it as their fault. Because the point is, you've still got to look at this in the perspective in the culture that we live in and view this kind of millennial generation as a result of that. So you look at politics these days. The Labour Party are borrowing policies from the Tories. The Tories are borrowing policies from the Labour Party. The Lib Dems seem to have gone on kind of a permanent sabbatical. There's no real politics for people to kind of grab onto. And so while I would say go ahead and criticise millennials, it's really important we view them as part of this kind of the prevailing culture of the time.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll start with Richard.
In terms of the sex, drugs and rock and roll lifestyle, I'm a pretty big purveyor of that, so I don't know if that's any other millennial in the room, but I guess there's a couple of things. One is to address a point that was directly made about millennial life chances. What no one is saying is that the vast majority of the people who, for instance, live in this country and well-developed industrialised nations are living in abject poverty and have horrific life chances. Oh, hello. There are a significant portion of the population who do, but progress of society does continue. What I have made the point of, and I think is a really clear one, is, as has been proved by numerous different studies, again, I think the Resolution Foundation are particularly good on this, is that if you look at the economic life chances of someone my age compared to someone 20 years older, I am meant to be working longer for less money, for a less good retirement, and so on and so forth. So I think that is quite clear. I don't think that's a major point. Like I said, I knew this was going to come on to freedom of speech and censorship, and I guess there's a couple of points. One, to address a point that was made directly by the man in front of me. You are correct, sir, in the sense that in terms of legally, racial and sexual and all other forms of discrimination are against the law. Of course they are. In reality, I think we all acknowledge that is not the case, and I could spout any number of different studies or data around everything from gender pay inequity around 22%, depending on who you believe, all the way through to rape cases and sexual assault, and the fact that 1 in 4 women in the United Kingdom will suffer some kind of sexual assault in their life. And we can talk about consent classes in a bit if you like, because it's not just about like drinking and having fun. It's about the fact that people don't understand that when you can't give consent, that is actually rape legally, all the way through to. Pardon?
Who doesn't understand that?
People who do it. I'll finish the other points and then I'll. So there's a bit of that. When it comes to the point around freedom of speech, like I said, I think the point by the lady in the glasses was a really, really good one. I don't think, genuinely, as someone, I work for the National Youth Students, so I spend the entirety of my time, and my girlfriend is in the audience, and she will attest to this, not in London, on university and further education colleges, campuses. Sorry, Hannah. And basically, my main overwhelming feeling on this is that the vast majority of students across the United Kingdom, and by the way, students is not a synonym for millennial, and I'm glad you talked about class, Brendan, and I'm very happy to take you to the council estate that I grew up on, but that's not the point, really, I guess. Thank you. The overwhelming feeling on freedom of speech is that debate and discourse and discussion is alive and well, that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of debates every single week on all sorts of interesting and controversial and potentially offensive topics. That has not stopped happening, and anyone who's giving the impression otherwise, unfortunately, I don't think understands the reality of that. What has changed, and I think is partially a consequence, actually quite interestingly, I think, of the individualism of Generation X, actually the generation before us, as well as what I think has been a liberation movement in a really exciting way around LGBT, BME, women and disabled liberation, has been conversations about what does constitute a hate crime, what is acceptable discourse, and if we have different perspectives and experiences, I would agree with Peter in the sense that I don't think that there is just a space for someone who self-identifies, say, as part of the LGBT community to talk about LGBT issues. I think allyship is really important. What I don't think is that straight people should dominate that conversation. I think it's a really basic I don't think it's about politics. That's polite, right? Like you should allow other people who know more about something to talk about something before you. So I guess maybe I'm feeling along, and I'm aware that I am speaking to the belly of the beast, as it were, because we are all purveyors of freedom of speech, and my politics may be different than a lot of people in this room. But in reality, I think that debate is live and well. I think those challenges are happening. I think there's an interesting conversation about different experiences and perspective. But I think this is just the next generation getting on with their stuff. And sometimes I would appreciate it if the generations before us just allowed us to do that and make the mistakes that we want to make and carry on doing and challenging new ideas. So that's how I feel.
Thank you. Brendan, you look like you have something to say.
Just on the question, this idea of oppressed groups, I really agree that there is this real desire to be oppressed now. When I speak on campuses, I meet these young, middle-class, white women with these extremely plummy voices. They grew up in the home counties, some were privately educated, and they tell me that they are structurally oppressed. I mean, and they're taking the piss. They are actually taking the piss. It's completely and utterly untrue. What they mean is that someone once said something rude to them on Twitter. That's what they mean. And what you have is this real cultivation of a sense of oppression that actually doesn't exist in the real world. And I think this idea that 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted is a perfect example of that. The reason that the NUS can spout utterly fake statistics like that is because they have redefined. Yeah, but you spout it. They have redefined the definition of sexual assault to include everything from being raped, which we all agree is a deeply serious crime of violence, to an unwanted sexual advance, right? Which means someone coming up to you in a pub and saying, "I fancy you, do you want a drink?" So they're mixing together of all these different elements of human experience. Firstly, undermines rape by putting it on a spectrum with normal behaviour, and secondly, gives this impression that women are oppressed in a way that is just not true. And it really actually undermines any discussion of class and real inequalities in society. The perfect example for me was when the feminist Caroline Criado Perez, who's this Guardian-style feminist, and I was on the radio with her once, and she said I suffered from male privilege or something like this. And when I was 16 years old, I was a Saturday boy in the vast supermarket chain owned by her father. And you think to yourself, this is where we've got to, a situation where someone can present themselves as the victim in response to someone whose wage labour used to fund their ponies and everything else when they were children. So it's bizarre, utterly bizarre. Just a quick thing on, firstly on Brexit. Brexit, in my mind, is the most positive thing to have happened in British politics in a generation. And I don't think all millennials were on the side of Remain. Of course not. I'll tell you who were. Mostly the middle-class ones and the well-educated ones, because the split on Brexit and Remain is largely a class one and an education one. The working classes and the less well-off and those who did not go to university voted Brexit because they still have a rebellious spirit. Those who have been socialised into the whole university way of thinking and that kind of self-victimisation and self-infantilisation and this belief that they need to be looked after by technocrats their whole life, voted for the EU. So the split is not generational at all. The split is largely a class one and a geographical one. So I think that's very important. I'm on the side of the working classes in relation to Brexit, I can tell you that much. Finally, I agree that this is actually not a generational issue. And a lot of the problems that the millennials express in terms of illiberalism and so on, it actually stems from earlier generations and their abandonment of the ideas of liberty and enlightenment and so on. And I think that's a very important point, that it is actually a political problem which millennials express in a very crude way, some of them, not all of them, but it stems from earlier generations and their failure over a period of time to stand up for the ideas of freedom of speech and liberty and enlightenment and equality.
Briefly, Brendan, just on the matter of inequality of privilege, surely millennials have a right to complain over wealth inequality. The Resolution Foundation, David Willits, found that in the 60s, rent was 10% of income, it's now 25%. Cost of renting has increased 4.5 times. These guys' generation will pay £44,000 more in rent than your generation did in their 20s. Surely they have grounds for complaint over that particular issue.
No, not at all. It's
Why not?
complete and utter
not
nonsense.
illiberal?
You know, they can do it if they want, but then everyone else can tell them they're talking absolute nonsense. This idea that the baby boomers had this wonderful life, and they all bought houses when they were 25, and they all went to university for free, and they didn't go to university. 7% of baby boomers went to university. They lived in absolute shitholes with outside toilets. These guys don't know what an outside toilet is. And if you look at that generation, if you look at that generation between 1946 and 1964, the people who were born in that generation, the vast majority of them grew up in squalor or in hardship. A tiny minority went to university and had a pretty nice time. Now, the millennials who are most vocal, the ones who are in the media and in politics, they are the offspring of that tiny minority of baby boomers who had a really nice time. So they think all baby boomers had a really nice time. I can assure you they did not. My parents are baby boomers. They came to London in 1970 from Ireland. And they did not go to university. They left school at 14. They had rubbish jobs. They had a really hard life. I think it's utterly unacceptable for either my generation, Generation X, or the millennials to look at the baby boomers and accuse them all of having privileged lives and to defame them in this way. It's simply untrue. Baby boomers had it infinitely harder than millennials. There's no question about that.
Thanks, Brennan. Rian Mansour, are you just a bunch of whingers?
I mean, I think Brennan needs to hang out with more young people, to be honest. He's had such negative experiences, and I'm really sorry about that. I want to make a point about Brexit, because this is really interesting that we're sort of supporting this establishment and we have all these issues. Listen, I just finished a Master's of Science in International Political Economy at LSE. I can talk you through all the reasons why the EU has problems. It's not an optimal currency area. But I also knew that the UK would be better within EU than without, and we see that in the drop of the pound, or the fact that LSE is now worrying about visas for their academics, or that they're paying so much more in material costs. There were consequences to Brexit, and some of us, knowing the faults of the EU, said, okay, maybe this referendum is not the way to resolve those issues, but rather keep the UK within the EU and then move forward. So I really fight against this idea that we've all mindlessly supported this institution that exists and we have no thought about it. A lot of us actually have debated, have thought about it, and it was, almost like the US presidential election. We don't like either candidate, but you have to choose one. And that was sort of the position that a lot of us were put in, where we decided that the EU was better than pulling out of it. We see the consequences of that now. I want to come back to this idea of sort of offense, and what I see from these panelists is this sense of entitlement, which is really interesting, that your opinion has to be heard by everybody else, and that you're deeply, deeply insulted if someone doesn't want to share a stage with you, or if someone takes issue with your opinion on mental health. Why does that bother you so much? We've, for generations, had people who had mental health issues who were not able to speak out on that. And your opinion was the dominant majority. Your opinion was that mental health issues don't exist. And finally, these people are saying, actually, well, they do. And for some reason, that's very offensive that you've now gotten pushback on these dominant norms that you've been propagating for a very long time. And I guess the question is, I again agree with both Richard and as well as Peter in terms of victim mentality, because I think there is sort of this danger of being too offended all the time. But I guess the question is always context. And the question further to that is, what better do you know about me than I know about myself? So sure, we can engage in a debate about people of color, and sure, you can give me opinion from a white, privileged background about what you think it means to be a person of color, but why don't I have the right to push back against that and say, actually, no, you're incorrect? Why is that so offensive? So it's interesting because just because we're vocalizing our opinions, we're the ones taking offense. But when you're told that we don't like what you say, or that it doesn't agree with the viewpoint that I have, you're suddenly claiming that I want to limit free speech and that I'm very offended and safe spaces. And this is, all this rhetoric that we hate freedom of speech. No, we just don't like your point of view. We just don't want to share a stage with you. Why is that the problem?
Thank you. Under what circumstances do you think that people should be banned from speaking in universities?
So I think my opinion will probably be a bit different from Richard's, because I do encourage debate, and I really thrive on debate, clearly, otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here. I agree with this point that unless it's inciting harm, then we have to draw some questions. So for example, when people said, let's ban Donald Trump from speaking, I said, are you ridiculous? You know, there is a line, and I agree with that. I agree there is a line. I think for me, it's the question of how balanced is the other side. So I know one university no-platformed a particular political party because their views were particularly classist, and they were sort of being very discriminatory against lower classes in the UK. And so the counter-argument, or the argument of that union to ban that speaker, was to say, well, you know what, we don't have people in those lower classes, people who are not at university, do not have the sufficient position in order to counter those views. And so I think we have to sort of take discretion with that. What is the ability to present the other side? But in outright banning, I'm very reluctant, because I think unless you can sort of prove causation that it is going to incite harm, again, examples of neo-Nazis and so on and so forth, unless they directly incite harm, unless we directly see the effect that someone will be harmed from it, I find it hard to argue. But I would push that you should consider the other side. And is it really a balanced debate?
Thanks. Emily, you run a free speech society at university. How do you feel about Rim's position?
Well, I mean, I do disagree. I find that it isn't a case of people not agreeing. So you make the point that people like Brendan don't like our views and therefore they're offended. I mean, that's not my experience at all. My experience is that people, I don't like that. I'm not that I'm offended by someone telling me that they think my views on mental health are ridiculous. I find it astonishing that they won't talk to me about it, that they'd rather write a blog post saying I'm stigmatizing or whatever, instead of actually discussing it. And they do not discuss it. They shut down the debate. And that is the problem. That is why we have the Free Speech Society, because we are sick to death of not being able to have discussions, not being able to have debates, because we're told you're not a girl, you're not a woman, you're not an ethnic minority, therefore your voice isn't as important. And even if it's not a direct ban, every voice is important on whatever issue. It doesn't matter if you've got a lived-in experience of being a woman, or you've got a lived-in experience of being black or white. You should still have an equal opportunity to discuss those views, and that's why we have our Free Speech Society, at least.
Thanks. I'm going to come to Peter finally, and then we're going to get back up to the floor, because we've all been banging on rather a lot. Peter, where do you stand on this particular dichotomy?
Well, I'd like to pick up the point about identity politics, which I think increasingly gets a very bad rap. And I agree that, as with the no platform and safe space policies, sometimes the way it's interpreted and enforced is too far, in my opinion. But let's just imagine, recall why identity politics came into existence. It came into existence because the dominant political narratives excluded women, black and ethnic minority people, LGBT people, the disabled, and so on. Because those voices were not heard, because their concerns were not addressed, those communities had to affirm and assert their identities and their right for those issues to be heard and addressed. So I don't think the problem is identity politics per se, but it is sometimes the way it's interpreted. So this idea that the victims know best and that we should listen to victims, I think broadly speaking that is correct, but it needs a few caveats. Of course, white people should check their privilege, straight people should check their privilege, men should check their privilege, of course. But at the end of the day, we need to be a little bit more nuanced. And I want to go back to the 1970s. In the 1970s, most LGBT people in this country internalized the dominant homophobia. They were often against gay pride parades or demands for law reform, because they said this would only invite further homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. I can remember going on a gay rights march in Earl's Court in 1973 and being pelted with beer cans and bottles by gay men at the Coleherne pub. They said, "You're bringing shame on us. You're making a fuss. You're going to incite further hatred." So I think we need to be really, really careful. At the same time, some of the best spokespeople in public life for LGBT people were straight people. Actors, politicians. In the 1980s, the best spokespersons we had for LGBT rights in the Houses of Parliament were not gay and lesbian and bisexual MPs, not even the closeted ones. It was straight people. It was straight people. Gavin Strang, Audrey Wise, Dawn Primarolo, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn. These were the straight people who spoke out most effectively and eloquently for LGBT rights. The final point I'd say is, are the millennials revolting? Well, yes, some of them are. But to what end? I think we need to ask really loud and clear, what are they revolting against? And there are some very good causes, but there's also, as we've heard, a lot of causes that are sort of morally and ethically ambiguous in the way they're being interpreted. I don't see the vision of an alternative society, a true revolutionary inspiration from the millennial generation. They are understandably concerned about their future job prospects, paying off their student loan debts, etc. But I don't see them having any major revolutionary, imaginative, alternative vision for the future of society and the world. Some do, but overall not.
Thank you. Okay, thanks a lot. Right, we're going to pick up the pace a little bit, so if you could try and be a little briefer in your points of floor so we can get things moving a bit now so everyone gets a chance to speak.
I just wanted to address a point that a few of you guys made especially about how safe spaces and so on allow minorities to be heard. I'm actually half Indian. Not many people know that. So a lot of the time I've been kind of talked over by people who aren't minorities, who seem to think they can save me as such. Who they'll be like, oh, we're just doing this to protect the Indian people. We're just doing this to protect the minorities. But I found a lot of the time they'll only say that until you say something they disagree with, and a lot of the kind of safe space mentality isn't actually pushed for by the minorities they claim to be for. For example, I'm a student at UCL, and last year for Black History Month they had a stand at the Freshers' Fair, and it was all white people on it. There was no one of an ethnic minority. I also had an issue where I was kind of confronted in a debate about cultural appropriation, to which I said, I think it's great if people want to kind of be a part of my culture. To which the two middle-class white girls said to me, but it's not about you, it's about the minorities that need to be protected. Really, really patronising. So I found that kind of identity politics related, especially for the people who kind of claim to be championing the rights of those less fortunate than them, it's only until those less fortunate than them disagree. I'd like to know what you think on that.
Thanks. Thank you. Check on here.
Yeah, I think the notion that we're in revolt is quite absurd, actually. I think the NUS, who hosted a feminist conference in London, I think about a year ago, was just sort of expressed the sort of deeply infantilizing sort of mentality that the women had replaced clapping with jazz hands because clapping might be triggering. I think that's quite infantilizing, and I think as well that not just that. Yeah, I think we're bringing back the lament the fact that we're bringing back the authority figures into our sex lives by having mandatory consent classes, when I think there's and with race as well. I think we all know that racism is bad and that rape is bad, and I think with regard to sex as well, I think it's not just words. I think there's a language that's beyond words, that isn't being acknowledged by. It's I think what's being espoused is that there has to be a verbal confirmation, which just is, I think, absurd, and it's not true.
Thank you.
Look, if you think that 80% of students at university have had a mental health problem, you don't understand mental health. If you think that 1 in 5 students has been sexually assaulted, you don't understand sexual assault. But one thing that's absolutely striking from this discussion is how so many millennials don't understand class. If you read about student politics in the 70s and 80s, there was a real sense of solidarity between radical working class people and radical students. There was a real sense of combined cause there. What you have today is the NUS, which is one of the most openly loathing of working class culture. I think I've ever known. If you look at the stuff around lad culture, the stuff around the anti-lad summit, this is an open expression of hatred for so many different aspects of working class culture, which is really ironic because if you are looking for an oppressed group in society today, have a look at working class men. These are people who are genuinely being left behind by the society that you're inhabiting. And at the same time, all you can do is speak about how your individual, one racial identity has been oppressed, another racial identity has been oppressed. Students today are completely blind to the question of class. And I think that's the biggest tragedy today. I've realised that whenever we talk about millennials, we're talking about posh people. I don't care whether you grew up on a council estate. When we talk about millennials, we are talking overwhelmingly about posh people. And the biggest tragedy of this is that when I see people in The Guardian talking about, I saw this hilarious video in The Guardian about millennials, about how economically hard up they are, they might never be able to buy their home. But then you realise the people making the video are people who can afford to have an internship at The Guardian, age 21, 22, and not be paid for 6 months, 8 months. When we talk about millennials, we're talking about the poshest young people in society. And at the same time, we are ignoring people who have genuinely been economically left behind.
Thanks. And
Hey there, thanks. I'd just like to pick up on a point that the lady on my left mentioned about why people would be annoyed that somebody didn't want to share a platform with them and whether or not that constituted an assault on free speech. Some of my best friends have been subjected to quite poisonous Twitter storms in the past, and I just wanted to know whether or not the panel felt that the vehicles of modern harassment or victimisation in the form of coordinated Twitter attacks or social media attacks can actually constitute an attack on free speech, and if so, why?
I'd also just, first of all, like to kind of call crap on the idea that the university doesn't have an issue with free speech, because if you go to the Spike Online's Free Speech University rankings, we found that last year 90% of universities censor free speech in one way or another, and that can range from deep-set policies, which have very explicitly censoring speech, right up to the kind of ridiculous bans. But nevertheless, getting back to whether millennials are revolting or not, it strikes me that there are things that are problematic in society. I don't think I'd agree with Richard about the fact that millennials are facing huge economic hardship, but life isn't perfect. That's, to me, an issue. I want life to be as good as it can be. It's how millennials react to that. So with the housing crisis, millennials do not call for bigger and better houses. They do not call for more housing. They call for rent caps. They call for a smaller piece of everyone of the ever-shrinking pie. At university, when people do say, sometimes people do say outrageous things and speakers say outrageous things, they don't say, in this kind of society, we want to have this kind of argument, and so I'm going to win the argument. They silence people. So the reaction is not actually at all revolutionary or revolting or radical. It's very conformist, it's very reactionary. And so while there are things in society that we want to change, and I would kind of give a little bit more room to you, Richard, and the other speakers there who are saying that there are things that are wrong with society, but it's about how you change it. And to me, millennials really are being completely pathetic.
Thanks. Let's come back to Richard then.
Sure.
Does the National Union students hate the working classes?
No, don't think so, as one of them. I don't know, this is a bit... So there's a couple of points I really actually agree with some of the people who have spoken. So, I did say it during the opening bit, right? University students are not synonymous with millennials. I think there is a class aspect to this that people don't talk about. I wouldn't disagree with that at all, actually, to be honest with you. So I do think class needs to be a part of that conversation. And when I talk about things like economic job prospects, when I'm talking about things like housing, I'm actually broadly not talking about university students who may have been part of the children of really privileged baby boomers or whatever that is. I am talking about, my family and my little brother and sister and are people who won't be able to afford to, for instance, do the unpaid internship at The Guardian because a lot of internships aren't paid, or won't be able to move to a city where there are any job prospects that aren't at the McDonald's that I worked at when I was 16. I don't look good in the hairnet. It wasn't a good look. So I do think there is a class aspect to this, and actually one of the things I do reflect on is thinking about that. And I guess this moves on to the second point, which is I think we should all just agree that we should not generalise like across the piece of this debate, because, and I have tried not to, but maybe I have, which is around the baby boomer generation and the privileges that came with that. I don't think that everyone who was a baby boomer was born with a spoon in the mouth. And likewise, I guess I would ask of people to think about the differences. I think Rian said it really well earlier in the speak, like the millennials are not a monolithic group, and there will be differences across class and all sorts of stuff. So the two hard and fast rules, right, where in terms of talking about some of this stuff, and one of them is, firstly, you can't legislate for people being dicks. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to, Peter, I think, said it really well, I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is broadly in the right space, right? When we talk about the fact that, for instance, racism is a problem and we should deal with that, and we are trying different things to make sure that different people from different perspectives get their voices heard. I broadly don't think, tell me if you think I'm wrong, audience, that you would disagree with that as a statement. Some people will use that as an interpretation that is different to, I guess, what was first intended or the views of other people, and that happens. And I guess the second part of that, and the some people are dick train of thought, is around Twitter storms, and we haven't actually talked about social media, and I think it's a really important component of it. There are people who would consider themselves progressive and lefty, and all manners of way liberal, or whatever you would put yourself, whatever the left language is, who abuse people on social media, who bully people and harass people, and which I do think constitutes, if not a very least a emotional abuse, right, is some kind of curtailment of freedom of speech. And the way millennials react and the individualism that people give to us, I think is partly seen through the prism of social media. One of the things I did this week, which is a final point, which probably shows you how we are framed as a generation, right, is I Googled, are the millennials, and then just saw what was happening. And the 4 things that came up straight, it's not a fun list. Are the millennials lazy, number 1, 2, screwed, 3, doomed, or 4, the worst generation ever? And actually, if we can get off of our respective high horses about thinking about us as a monolithic group, that some middle-class students at UCLU are representative of the millennial generation, and vice versa, that Brendan O'Neill was representative of, well, anything, I guess, is that I think that would be a good place to carry on the debate from.
Thanks. Rian Mansour.
Okay, so it's interesting because we sort of talked about, I actually want to address this audience member who's talking about how people are sort of championing your rights for you, or arguing that you are not disadvantaged enough to have an opinion. And I think that's precisely the point, actually. The point is that most people don't have an actual understanding of what racism is, or doesn't actually understand what it means to be of a particular race. And that's why the conversation is not over. So I agree with Richard in that, the way that people interpret that, it depends. And I think this is something that we need to keep coming back to, is that it depends on the institution and the way that you enforce it. But clearly there are still conversations to be had. Something that I have to get out is this concept of safe spaces, because I think safe spaces is so demonized in the media, and I don't fully understand why. Because a safe space, at its fundamental core, is a space in which people can converse respectfully. That's it. So if I want to have a conversation about being an Arab woman, there's no rule that says this is a safe space, therefore white men are not allowed. White men are totally allowed in a safe space so long as they converse with me respectfully. So it depends on the institution. If the institution decides I want to put in jazz hands as part of a safe space, sure, you can criticize those people who decided that jazz hands are the way to do it, right? As one of the audience members has pointed out. But if a safe space is just speaking conversely to each other, I still don't understand why this is an issue. I don't understand why people are so opposed to the idea that people just want to converse respectfully. And to be honest, until I moved to the UK, I'd never heard the word safe space in my life. I'm a Canadian. And so speaking to each other respectfully was just sort of the assumption of the life that I lived. And then when I moved here, it was this demonized thing, safe spaces. I think it's fine to criticize what people choose to do within those safe spaces, or, for example, telling this audience member, you're not allowed because you are not colored enough to be here. Sure, we can fully have a debate about that. But I would push back against this idea that safe spaces are inherently evil, because it simply means being respectful to each other.
Thanks. Brendan, is it possible for someone to imagine what it could possibly be like to be someone less privileged than themselves?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's humanism the ability to empathise and offer solidarity to people who you may not have had the same experience as, but you understand the predicament they come from and you want to work with them in order to change things. I think that's what humanism has, humanist politics has traditionally been about, whereas what we have now is this very divisive anti-humanist politics which says, well, you can't say this because you don't have the right skin colour. You can't say this because you don't have the right genitals. It's completely bizarre and actually borderline racist, definitely reactionary. It's a very bad form of politics. I think, Richard, you really need to stop playing the working class card, because it doesn't matter where you come from. You work for an institution that is explicitly anti-working class. And we've heard from the guy in the audience in relation to the things that it bans. It bans lads magazines, it bans tabloids like The Sun and The Express. I'm talking about student union offsprings. It bans certain forms of speech. It bans lad banter. The NUS has policies on actual lad banter. I mean, this is surreal. It bans the making of sexual noises on some campuses. You know, let's not beat around the bush. We know who this is aimed at. This is not aimed at polite middle-class young men who were brought up in the home counties, right? It's aimed at people who maybe came from your council estate, but you've kind of become some kind of bizarre turncoat or something. So you need to, what we're talking about is the institution that you work for. We're not talking about your experience. We don't really mind about your experience very much. We're talking about the institution and the politics. And this comes back to the discussion about millennials and what the visible expression of millennialism is, which is not a generational thing at all. It's a class thing. This is a very particular section of society which has particular views and which foists them onto society as representative of a whole generation, and it's not. Let me just give you one example. All you ever hear from millennial women who write in the media or who are active in student politics about sex is that sex is dangerous. Drunken sex is bad, sex on drugs is bad, it could be rape, you should probably avoid it, and you should, you know, talk to some therapist if you ever have bad sex that you don't like. I cannot tell you how utterly different that is from the young women I grew up with, who go to Spain, who go to Spain for 2 weeks and have sex with 27 men, completely off their nut on booze, and they don't think they've been raped. They don't think it was a harmful experience. They think it was a fun experience. Now, if you say that to millennial women who are in the media, they will say, oh, but those women have got internalized misogyny. In other words, they're brainwashed. They don't know their own minds. They don't know what's in their own self-interest. This deeply disturbing and patronizing argument. This is a class issue fundamentally. It's a cultural issue. People have different ways of life and different opinions, and millennials do not represent that. The final point I want to make is the worst argument that is pushed by these influential millennials, as we should refer to them, it's not all millennials, the worst argument that they push is this notion that free speech is somehow damaging to marginalized groups. This is so obnoxious. I mean, we have to treat this very seriously. Their argument is that free speech is beneficial to white privileged males because they can talk nonsense all day long. But it's really bad for black people. It's really bad for women. It's really bad for gay people. Because they are harmed by certain words and certain ideas. This is such a dangerous idea. Every marginalized group in history who has fought for a progressive cause has seen freedom of speech as their greatest ally, because it's the means through which they argue against their oppression. What these guys are setting up is like a neo-colonialist racket, where they see it as their job to protect minorities from speech and ideas. That is not progressive. That is the fundamental essence of reactionary politics.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks a lot. Briefly, we're going to quick comment for you, then we're going to have a quick point from the floor and then sum up. So,
one of the issues that's been touched upon is the way in which much of the millennial discourse is about the policing of language, that you mustn't use certain words or phrases, and I can sympathise with quite a bit of that, in the sense that, you know, I don't think women should have to put up with sexist language, that black people shouldn't have to put up with racial slurs, and so on and so on. But what strikes me is the huge amount of energy put into, for example, policing language, compared to the amount of energy put into the really big issues that affect young people as a whole and the wider society. So you might have thought, given the experience of younger generations in the past with a history of radical protest, that students would be in the forefront of the anti-austerity movement. and actually coming up with an alternative to the austerity agenda and coming up with methods and tactics to defeat and expose it. But apart from a few little marches here and there, we haven't seen much. You know, on the war in Syria, the greatest human rights crisis of our moment, where are the students? I was in Whitehall before I came here this afternoon. I didn't see a single left-wing or student protest banner. And looking in that crowd, I saw 4 other people I know who are left-wing activists. The left and the student movement was totally absent. They are deserting the students and the civilian population of Aleppo and other cities who are now being subjected to war crimes and crimes against humanity. My generation, we marched against the Greek colonels, against Franco's fascism, against Pinochet, against apartheid. We had this vision of global solidarity, standing with oppressed people fighting for their freedom. Where are the millennials standing with the people of Syria?
We're going to take 2 quick points from the floor. I'm afraid that's all we're going to have time for.
Hello. Just to those who think that many millennials haven't seen an outside toilet, last weekend I viewed a house with an outside toilet. It was on the market for £1.3 million. That is how bad the situation is.
It also had an inside toilet, right?
If you look at the alternative movements of the 60s generation, so much of it was about living cheaply in an alternative way that didn't involve having to work 60 hours a week to pay the rent on a 1-bed flat. And our generation don't have those options. Either you live with your parents and you're under parental authority, or you get a job, move out and pay your own bills, and you're under the authority of capitalism. But that space that the 60s radicals lived in doesn't exist for our generation.
Hi, to Brendan, I would just like to say it's been a while since I've seen someone speak so eloquently on a topic you seem to not have much nuance about. You seem to hold an internal illegality, whatever that word is, where you said, students, they're not from working class backgrounds, and then Richard said, I'm from a working class background, and you said, Richard, I don't want to hear about it. And I just find it disappointing. There are a lot of people who are against feminism or intersectionality. That's a great word. You should look it up, because then we would also be talking about working class men and not thinking that feminism is about hating men, or that talking about gender means hating men, or talking about race means hating white people. If you really go beyond the headline that's really easy to put on an article by someone that doesn't like those issues, then that's all you're going to get, and it becomes really easy to just bat that away. Look underneath that and see that talking about these issues is about creating a more equitable society, and this is how our generation is doing it.
We're going to hear for no more than 1 minute each from each of the panellists to sum up.
I want to question one of the things Brendan said, in that he said that lad culture is anti-working class, and that posh ones are respectful. So it seems like you're almost anti-working class, because you're insinuating that working class people cannot be respectful. Look at a rugby team. I play women's rugby. Tons of those fun women and lad culture fully exist at LSE, which is a highly privileged institution. So lad culture is not necessarily an attack on working class, and I sort of fight against this idea that by disliking lad culture, that posh men are just so sophisticated that they don't need the same lessons, because that in itself is classist. So let's go back. I think a lot of the points that the audience made has been great, very interesting, very engaging, especially the youths who have talked about 1.5 million houses with outdoor toilets. And I think something that we need to consider is that, sorry.
You've got to be quick.
Yeah, sorry. Something that we need to consider is that there is a dominant view, right? So we've been talking about freedom of speech, but just remember that freedom of speech does not exist in a vacuum. There are people that are favored to speak over other people. There are platforms that are not shared equally, and that's something that you need to consider in the millennial voice, is that I don't think many of us are opposed to this idea of freedom of speech. We just want to make sure that everyone has a turn to speak. Thank you.
I just think we shouldn't be downplaying this idea of kind of censorship and freedom of speech. We've heard that safe spaces are harmless and that they're just places to be respectful, but my experience at university is that is not true. And why can't we be disrespectful? Why can't we sit in a room and challenge disrespectful ideas? Why do we have to have spaces where we we're protected, we're shielded from those. So I think it is really an issue. Student unions, love them or hate them, are full of people who want to censor and want to control the behaviours of students, whether that be banning the sun or banning blurred lines or imposing consent classes, where it is extremely patronising to tell all young men they should go along to a class because they don't understand the conditions of a sexual relationship. People who are going to rape, which thankfully is a minority, are probably not going to have their mind changed by sitting in a consent class being told that they can't have sex with a drunken woman or whatever. These assaults on freedom are happening every single day in UK campuses, and thankfully there are some millennials who are starting to kick back and challenge that.
I guess my three main points really in summation would be, one, I think millennials are revolting. I don't think that is a monolithic group. I don't think that the way it's being characterised by a lot of what I would consider quite thin-skinned older generations would understand that. But I think that is happening. I think that's welcome. I think that's good. I think every generation should try and define itself and the society it wants around it. I would agree with a point that I don't think we've articulated what an alternative vision of society is. I think we'll get there. Give us a chance, which leads me on to my second point, which is around that this generation will try new and different things. There'll be different ideas. I don't think they in any way undermine fundamental freedoms that have been won for us by people before. What I do think is that they're different, and that scares and concerns some people. And I would ask people to allow this generation of different sorts of people from different backgrounds the opportunity to try their own stuff. Get off our shit, we'll figure it out. And the third and final thing, I guess, is that I think that we've heard a lot of really scary things around freedom of speech, around lad culture, around all sorts of stuff around imposing censorship. And I actually think Rian's point was the best one, which is that a lot of this stuff is around respect. I think a lot of the stuff is around listening. I don't think that there is a mass book burning in a students' union somewhere across the United Kingdom. I don't think that exists. I mean, honestly, I don't think that will happen. I would ask. We haven't burned books in a students' union, Brendan. No, we haven't. That's nonsense. Okay. So my final point. Sure. So my final point would be that I think that the millennials are evolving onto a new point of politics. I think that's different for a lot of different people. I think that's really exciting, actually. And I would ask us to be given the opportunity to articulate that in our own different way, as each generation before has. And thank you for listening.
Student union feminists at both Goldsmiths in London and Cambridge burnt in public the literature of the Socialist Workers' Party. So book burning is happening.
Right.
And just 3 points very quickly. I'm so sorry to hear that someone had to view a house that had a toilet outside and inside. I mean, that's really hard life. I'm very sorry to hear that. You obviously don't know what I mean by outside toilet. There was only an outside toilet, and 3 or 4 families had to share it. That's what I'm talking about. Show me where that exists, please. It doesn't. In terms of choosing between living with your parents or suffering under capitalism, are you serious? Choose capitalism every single time. Capitalism won't patronize you and make you coffee late at night, and as a consequence, you will grow up and become an adult instead of being a baby for your whole bloody life. Final point, my only problem with influential millennials, just so we know who we're talking about these lovely people here, influential millennials, not millennials, they are the enforcers of mainstream authoritarian politics. They're not revolting against it, they're enforcing it. And I think they fail to recognize how fundamentally beneficial it is to the rulers of society that young people are redefining themselves as weak and vulnerable and in need of help and in need of therapy. Who benefits from that? Not young people, the rulers of society who like their young people placid and pathetic. That's who's benefiting from your new politics.
Well, I'd like to finish on a positive note. Despite my caveats and qualifications, I would agree that millennials are more committed to equality and diversity than any preceding generation, and that's a really good, positive thing. All I'm saying is, let's not allow that commitment to lead down the road to restrictions on free speech and open debate, which are fundamental for a free and open society.
Thank you.